And it's my pleasure today to introduce Ms. Fahmy. Randa Fahmy is internationally recognized for her work in global government affairs, energy policy, and national security, with more than 30 years of legal and public policy experience. Presently, she's president of Fahmy Hudome International, a strategic consulting firm that provides critical advice and counsel to international and domestic clientele. She was previously appointed by President George W. Bush as the U.S. Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy, served as counselor to U.S. Senator Spencer Hayden, in practice as an attorney with the law firm Willkie, Farr and Gallagher. Her opinions on international diplomacy and energy policy have been published in various high-profile news outlets. She appears frequently as an analyst on energy and national security issues on much needed depth. She received a JD from Georgetown University Law Center and a BA from Wilkes University, served on several boards, including the U.S. Energy Advisory Board, St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, served on the U.S. Department of State Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, and chaired the Maryland Commission for Women and the Maryland Governor's Commission on Middle Eastern Affairs. Join me in welcoming Ms.
And I appreciate being introduced by a fellow political scientist. Welcome and thank you so much for this invitation to speak at the Mroz Global Leadership Institute. You know, it's interesting, I've known John and Karen Mroz, who are the founders, for many, many years, and when Karen initially called me and connected me with Max, it was a different time. It was 2 months ago. And if it teaches you anything, especially for the students in the room, how much global events can change at the turn of a dime. So I'm so pleased to be here today to address an issue that is so very important, and that's international energy diplomacy. And I would like to add a little bit at the end of that title, in a time of turmoil, which we're in right now. So today I thought I would speak a little bit, and I'm happy to take your questions after I give some comments about the domestic U.S. situation. We're all worried about gas prices, a little bit about how that's determined, what goes into that. Talk a little bit about Opec, which many of you heard, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and how they figure into it. Some current developments. I'll touch upon Ukraine and Russia, obviously. Diplomacy, and where that diplomacy is taking place and where it's not taking place. And some solutions. I never like to speak about things unless I offer some solutions. So to begin with, I begin with the good news. The #1 producer of oil and gas in the world is the United States of America. It's a great, great figure. We're at about 34 trillion cubic feet. That's how we measure natural gas, otherwise known as TCF. And we're producing between 17 and 18 million barrels. The good news there is that's pretty much what we consume. So you're probably asking to yourself, why aren't we energy independent? Why do we need to be begging other countries for gas and for oil? And I'll go into that a little bit about that. The top 2 countries we in the United States actually import from, you're going to be surprised at this figure, it's Canada and Mexico. Why? Because of the location of where we're situated, Canada, Mexico, the United States. And again, I'll get to a little bit more of that. It used to be then after Canada and Mexico, Russia and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so you're asking yourself, why are gas prices so high? And keep in mind, through all of this, the oil and gas are global commodities. That means not only is it priced globally, but it's also the supply and demand affects the global oil and gas markets. So what goes into when you pull up at a gas station and you're filling up, and depending on where you live, if you live here, I didn't check the price of gas this morning in Charleston, but where I left it was $4.50. So #1, it's the cost of crude. Right now the cost of crude oil is a little over $100 a barrel. And that cost itself is affected by geopolitical factors. Of course, the biggest one right now is Russia's war on Ukraine. okay? The second thing is refining costs. So when you import petroleum into the US, as we do in some cases for Canada and Mexico, you have to refine it. It just doesn't come in off of a ship, okay? Here you go, fill it up. It has to be refined. And we in the United States have some challenges there, okay? The third thing is distribution and marketing, how it's being distributed all over the US. There's also marketing costs for that. You guys heard supply chain questions and problems. Supply chain is part of that. And of course taxes, which frankly doesn't really affect the price all that much except for what you see the difference between, say, California and New Jersey. Okay, you're adding a little bit of taxes into that. Most US government administrations' policy is to become energy independent here in the United States so that we don't suffer these shock values of rising gas prices. But the reality is we really haven't ever achieved that. And why is that? So, as I go back to the original question, if we're the #1 producer of oil and gas, then why aren't we energy independent? Well, primarily, it's the old real estate adage, location, location, location. You look at the United States, okay, right? You have to have refineries, you have to have infrastructure and transportation. Back to the supply issue, okay? And our refinery capacity, ladies and gentlemen, is not great in the US. It's part of our overall crumbling infrastructure challenges here in the United States, and also, all depending on where you live, it's more challenging to get that petroleum to market. And that is why, my friends, we're not where we should be. So let's talk a little bit about what you probably have all heard about, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, based in Vienna, lovely place to be. Who are those members? Out of the 13 members of OPEC, 7 of them are from the Middle East. The other 6 are not. So, interestingly enough, we do a little roll call here: Algeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, the Republic of Congo, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. Okay? Who is not in OPEC is actually quite interesting: Ecuador, Indonesia, and Qatar. Now, Russia is an observer, Egypt's an observer, Mexico is an observer, Norway, and Oman. What are observers? Well, OPEC gets together every few months. They sit around a beautiful big table in Vienna, mostly, and they talk about production levels. How much are we going to produce today? And they're supposed to be coordinating amongst themselves, and those observers sit around and observe what they're doing. So that basically, largely, these group of countries together can get together and pretty much set the price of what they want. Price fixing, in essence. You may ask from a Middle East perspective why Qatar, who's a major country in the Middle East, albeit little, left OPEC. And this gets into the geopolitical problems that they had. They were fighting with their Gulf brothers in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, over a number of things. Big man on campus, big woman on campus, whatever. They also, some of the other Gulf countries have problems with Al Jazeera. You may know the network Al Jazeera, owned by the Qatari government. They happen to be quite critical of all of the Arab brethren in the Middle East, except, of course, their own government. So that kind of rubbed a lot of their brothers the wrong way. So Qatar left OPEC. They'll tell you it's because they're a big natural gas producer, and they really don't need to be sitting in OPEC meetings talking about petroleum. So what's going on right now? What are some of the current developments that are affecting? Of course, the big one is Russia's war on Ukraine. And I remind you that Russia twice, not once, but twice cut off the natural gas supply to Ukraine. Once was in 2006, and again in 2009. And I have to say, the US successfully in 2009 was able to quell that, because they're shutting the gas off. That is a humanitarian disaster, because that's what a lot of Ukrainians rely upon for their living. Of course, you may have heard that President Biden just announced last week that there is a ban on Russian oil. Now, let's come back to the original thing I said. Well, we have so much oil in the United States. Why are we importing Russian oil? Again, for the reasons I told you. We don't have a refinery capacity for all of what we're producing. Transportation, whatnot. So yes, we were importing oil from Russia. And the Biden administration decided to ban that. So we're no longer importing. How are we making that up? The question becomes. And unfortunately, the Biden administration decided to call the Saudis and the Emiratis. Again, from a global picture, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are one of the largest producers of petroleum. So to make up the ban in Russian imports, President Biden decided to pick up the phone, call the Saudis and Emiratis, ostensibly to say, please increase your production to make up for this. And again, it'll help the global oil market, it'll ease the price, especially in the United States, of gasoline, about to go through a bad recession. Help, and I'm sorry to tell you that not only did the Saudis and Emiratis not even take this call, okay? And the White House, I think, had some excuses about that, but that the Saudis actually announced that the global oil market is normally priced in US dollars, good for us. That's a 1974 Nixon era policy, that the global oil market is priced in US dollars. And that's for a variety of reasons. That's how the oil is traded on the market. Saudi started by announcing maybe they'll start to price some of their petroleum in the Chinese monetary instrument, the yen. And that, again, would be very difficult for the United States. Not a lot, not the majority of, but a small percentage of. This was the Saudis' first way of kicking the United States, frankly, in a time when we need them. Now, the second reason you ask, you may say, okay, why are the Saudis not responding to the President Biden's calls? Okay, and for the same very reason, why are the Emiratis not responding to these sorts of calls to increase oil production? So I can say without hesitation, the Saudis have some problems with the United States at the moment. I would say, number one, they're not happy with our policy with respect to Iran. So many of you may know that the Saudis and the Iranians are huge rivals for a variety of reasons dating back to religious divisions. But the Biden administration's policy has been to bring back this agreement with Iran, otherwise known as the JCPOA. Okay? Trump crushed it. So, right, we had Obama, then we had Trump, then we had Biden, right? And Biden wants to bring it back, and the Saudis aren't happy with that. The second reason is we have some disagreements over the war in Yemen. We don't like what the Saudis and the Emiratis are doing in Yemen, and we've made that very clear. So the Saudis have said, okay, you don't like what we're doing in Yemen, I'm not taking your phone call. It really is as simple as that. But third, I have to say, many of you have heard about the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was brutally murdered inside the consulate in Istanbul. He was a Saudi journalist working for the Washington Post. The President Biden during the campaign had some not so nice things to say about the journalist, the killing of the journalist and the Saudis. And one individual in particular, our intelligence agency found was responsible for that is the Crown Prince, who's the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. So you can kind of see why when President Biden picked that phone up to call the Saudis, talk to the Crown Prince, they said, sorry, went to voicemail, okay, basically. Which is the first time I've ever seen something like that happen. Not saying that it hasn't happened before. The second person, or the second country, excuse me, to point out is the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates tends to be somewhat of an ally on certain issues, but again, the United Arab Emirates did the same thing to President Biden. They refused to take his call, similarly on issues of Yemen, not happy with him, not happy with some of the other things going on, again, having to do with Iran. So that's sort of, interesting developments of what's going on. So 2 months ago, before when I was saying I was invited to come speak here, Max and I were speaking to each other and talking a little bit about Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2, you may have heard about it, is a gas pipeline that goes from, it's supposed to help Russia and in Europe, frankly, supplies it. It's Nord Stream 2, so there's a Nord Stream 1, which, by the way, is up and running. Gas supplies from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Okay? So Nord Stream 2 was in development at the time. And a few months back, the Biden administration lifted a waiver and allowed Nord Stream 2 to continue, but there was debate in Congress. So I think, Max, at the time you and I were talking, you were asking me about it, and I said, I'm not really sure. Well, it now has become the issue, of course, and the first thing, when Russia attacked Ukraine, U.S. Senate, House, and the President, in agreement, they shut down development of Nord Stream because it was primarily Gazprom, a Russian company that was developing it, and also there was a CEO that they put sanctions on. So Nord Stream 2 pretty much has been shut down. And it's about an $11 billion project, so you can imagine how big that is. Okay? Another way, frankly, to sanction and punish Russia is this Nord Stream 2 and the halting of that particular pipeline. Interestingly enough, China and Russia have teamed up now as a result of the war. They're talking about building some kind of gas pipeline to China. China doesn't have that right now. Not really sure if that's going to go ahead, but because Russia is being sanctioned, their only customer seems to be right now is China. And last, just a little bit more of some current developments around the Middle East. Egypt is actually boosting its gas exports to Europe. So Egypt, surprisingly enough, not a member or even an observer at Opec, has amazing natural gas supplies. So they're starting to rethink where their markets could be, and they're looking at Europe. Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon are actually talking about, again, cooperation, which is an interesting thing on countries that don't normally cooperate. Again, on gas, there seems to be quite a reserve of gas in the Mediterranean. So that's kind of good news. And even in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, there's discussion about an Israel to Gaza pipeline for gas. It's about $60 million, and our friends in Qatar are talking about funding that. So those are some of the current developments that are going on right now. But let's focus on probably what we came to talk about today is diplomacy. So in this crazy geopolitical world that we're in, what are the kinds of diplomacies? As I mentioned, I talked about OPEC, and OPEC gets together the producers, and they have emergency meetings, which they will have some coming up. Call an emergency if they can't take a flight over to Vienna. They sit and have secured telephone calls. How much should we produce? What levels should we put out? They know right now at $100 a barrel, long term, it's not sustainable and it's not good for them as an organization. So that's, petro diplomacy amongst themselves. There's also, many people don't know, an institution called the International Energy Agency. And when I was in government, I spent a lot of time there. It's based in Paris, France. And that is the answer to OPEC's producer crowd. This is the consuming crowd. So the largest consumers of petroleum and gas gather in Paris, France, and again, try to coordinate about what their reaction is going to be to the energy markets. There's a relatively new organization that, again, when I was in government, I had some influence in initially funding it. It's called the International Energy Forum, based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And it is, I say, an attempt to bring producers and consumers together, to have some kind of diplomatic dialogue, so that things that are happening now don't happen. But the jury's out on it, not really sure. Because in reality, the producers, especially those OPEC members, they're not very transparent about what they're producing. So let's say, all right, everybody in OPEC, we're going to get together and we're going to produce X million barrels. Well, they all cheat, and they all blow past that. Especially at $100 a barrel, they're blowing past their production. So they're not telling their brethren who's sitting around the table. So I'm not sure, although it's a great idea, the International Energy Forum, and a very good friend of mine is actually the Secretary General. I'm not sure. The jury's out about whether that's working yet. So let's talk about some formal or informal calls for diplomacy. So, just a little bit of history. Post 9/11, I was in the government in the Bush administration, and we implemented something called quiet diplomacy. We felt at the time that quiet diplomacy was the best way to go about getting some of these producers to bolster the global oil markets, particularly the global oil markets. At that time, we hadn't fully developed the gas here in the United States domestically. So, quiet diplomacy is about calling, talking, knowing what leverage you have with those producers, and having quiet phone calls. Not telling the press, not telling anybody about what those conversations were. And we felt at the time that it works, and the question is whether or not quiet diplomacy would be a good thing exercised today. Another thing is long-term solutions, right? And so, I have to say, I'm sorry, the last thing I just want to say on the diplomatic front, on the issue of making these phone calls and asking producers to produce is because, as I mentioned, the Saudis and the Emiratis would not accept President Biden's phone calls. President Biden then called the Venezuelans. Now, as you may know, Venezuela, it's not exactly a U.S. ally, nor are they a government we would want ourselves after. And so I find it highly ironic that we're now dialoguing with the Venezuelans of all people, dictator, to boost those global energy supplies. And interestingly enough, I have to say, sort of in exchange for all of this, and I don't know what's going on 100% behind the scenes, but the Venezuelans have released 2 American prisoners. They had been pulled. So there's something going on. So let's go to solutions, and then I'm happy to take all your questions. So what's a girl to do with, high gas prices, right? I have to say, not since the 1973, what I call the Arab oil embargo. So for the students in the room who may not have even been born then, or 10 years after that, or 20 years after that, in 1973, the Arab oil producers got together in a group and decided that they were going to cut back production. And so we had long oil lines. It was over the Arab-Israeli war that was going on back then. So they cut oil production, and we had long lines of gasoline. So not since 1973, I think, have we seen such turmoil here in America on the issue of petroleum. It's quite turbulent. Let's talk about what could be U.S. solutions. Again, back to this idea of energy independence. Okay, so domestic oil production. Guys, it's not like you can switch on and off. We have to have long-term solutions for domestic production. Some of this, of course, there was, I say was because it was halted, a pipeline bringing gas from Canada through the United States. It's Keystone, called the Keystone Pipeline. Again, we had the first tranche, if you will, of that completed. The second was the Keystone XL pipeline coming from Canada, Montana, Nebraska. It was stopped, okay, in Nebraska. And the question is, again, President Biden halted that. It is policy of the Biden administration to focus on environmental solutions and renewable issues, not oil and gas production. As a result of that, he halted that. And some have made calls to restart that again to protect us from these types of market fluctuations. Of course, there's wind energy, relatively new but growing, where I have a home off of the Jersey shore. There's a company out of, I think it's out of Denmark, who's going to be building wind turbines off of the Jersey shore to produce more winds. Of course, nuclear energy, in a good, nice, clean way that protects everybody. As I mentioned, increasing refinery capacity is important, bolstering our infrastructure so we have better refineries here. Solar, I personally have been looking into something like that, getting solar power, but they're not quite where we have to say they're economically, it makes sense. Also, again, natural gas, liquefied natural gas here in the US. And relaxing some of the regulatory requirements. Right now, again, we're back to this ban on certain areas of the United States, whether it's because of nature preserves, federal lands, because of, drilling, health concerns. Those restrictions might have to be lifted. You have to balance, right? Regulations versus the cost to the environment. Well, the costs to the health of the people in the area, and that has been being addressed quite well in the past couple of years. My end of this, and I'm happy to take all your questions, is the bottom line is there is no short-term solution to this, what's going on right now. And I think we're going to see some easing of the $100 a barrel oil as hopefully the global situation calms down a bit. And I'm hopeful for some kind of solution shortly on the Russia-Ukraine war, but I don't know what the end game here is for Putin, the madman, where he's going with all of this. But he knows very well what he's doing, I think, and one of the things, aside from, of course, the humanitarian cost and the hit to our international legal system is turmoil in the petroleum market. So there's no short-term solution. There's more America could do. And really, our energy policy, I just want to say, end it here, it really is a policy driven by who's in power at the moment. And so it's what administration generally sets our energy policy with the approval of Congress, the House and the Senate. The question is, where are we going now over the next 2 years? And the Biden administration's focus has been a lot on the environment and climate change and what we can do for that, not foreseeing what's going on now. And because of that, there may have been even more of an impact of this global energy crisis. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take your questions. If I know the answer, I'll answer it. If I don't, I will tell you I don't know the answer. Yes, hi.
How has fracking helped us become energy independent? I know the price of oil determines fracking profitable or not. So we're at $100 a barrel now. It's got to be very profitable.
Yeah, so great question. So fracking is the procedure by which we extract those minerals from underneath the ground. Now, there was a huge push for fracking, I want to say, towards the end of the Bush administration, and particularly I'm from Pennsylvania, so there's quite a bit of fracking going on. Now, there was an objection by individuals who said that this might not be safe. If you're drilling down in there, what's it going to do not only to the environment, but the people surrounding the area where they are digging? Well, the reality is there were lots of studies by universities and other experts who said it's absolutely safe. And the way that they're doing this is through water. So water is not going to be affecting the environment or the people's health. So actually, that was one of the big driving factors. It was a huge boom. And then what happened? The producers of natural gas decided, oh my gosh, what? The United States is doing fracking? We better lower the price. And when they did that, the fracking industry all but collapsed. They were able to manipulate the prices so that they were able to do that. Now, that's not to say that they may pick back up, but honestly, a lot of these developers that were going into the states in the US have just given up and said, why are we doing this when gas prices, as in natural gas prices, are so low? But there might be another push for this now. And again, with administrations, approval, non-approval, approval, non-approval, right? After President Bush, it was Obama 1, Obama 2, Trump, Biden. So you get this policy like this. Hope that answers it? Yeah. Yes?
Thanks for being here today and for your remarks. So many countries, their priorities have changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right?
Yeah.
So Venezuela, maybe we don't care so much about democracy if they're willing to export more oil. Saudi Arabia, we don't care so much about the war in Yemen if they'll export more oil. Iran is kind of a big one, right? Do you agree that the JCPOA, that would have been re-signed, and if it wasn't for Russia putting up the roadblock because they are the ones that have to import the nuclear fuel, and that they're the ones that have said, no thanks, we don't want you guys to do that. That's the one person. The second one is France and Germany. France is so much easier for them because they have so much nuclear. Germany is so much, they import so much, like 40% of oil. Why hasn't Germany gone a little bit more nuclear?
Yeah, okay. So let's start with Iran first. So I can tell you pretty factually since the beginning of the Biden administration, when he came in, and I know the gentleman whose portfolio it is to negotiate, or shall I say renegotiate, the JCPOA, they were having problems even before any of this. And absolutely no question that Russia was meddling in this, but the JCPOA was not a slam dunk. There was all sorts of problems before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so I'm not so sure. I mean, I could go on and on about the Iranians and what they tell us and what they actually do, whether or not there's nefarious purposes, but I won't go into that. I can tell you right now they're not at their maximum capacity. They're still, that's a situation where sanctions have worked. They're still hurting spare parts. They don't have a north-south pipeline. I mean, they can do all they want on energy, nuclear weapons, but they're not good on the petroleum side of things. Now, I can't speak because I'm not a French citizen nor am I a German citizen, but I would tell you from my observations, it is a mission-driven thing. So France, for a variety of reasons, including one of the best nuclear energy companies that there is, they have those. It's clean. I think we've developed, again, I grew up near 3 Mile Island, thinking my place in New Jersey, 3 Mile Island, that was a disaster back then, thank God. But, and it didn't create problems, but we've gotten so much more better on the nuclear energy technology, so much more safer. And I think the French, for a long time, have developed it, have made sure it's clean, and have been able to really be successful in that area. The Germans, on the other hand, from my understanding, they're very, very focused on environmental issues. And because of that, that seems to me to be the biggest objection, that somehow nuclear energy is not good for that. And that is why they have not developed it. But again, I'm not an expert in either the French or the German policy in the governments, but back when I was in government, that was really developing as a difference. Yes?
So, two-part question. First part of the question is, have we reached peak oil, the maximum consumption of oil, or is that far out in the future? Some people say it's 2030, some people say it's 2050.
In the U.S., you're asking peak oil?
Globally.
Yeah, globally. Okay.
Second is not really a question. So I'm a former energy banker. Yeah. And both Mexico and Venezuela have terribly mismanaged their oil field. They're kidding. They basically use it as a political piggy banks. And I know a lot of Venezuelans from my energy days that have left, all the people that were, got forced out and came to America and went to Europe. It's going to take a tremendous investment, which Venezuela does not have, especially, to bring the production back up online.
Yeah.
So how did we get there?
Yeah. I don't know. Well, let's talk Mexico and Venezuela. Totally agree with you. Always having issues with corruption, frankly. Yeah. It was a political piggy bank, and when you get into that, it's problematic. I don't know how they're going to get back online. But all I do know is the Biden administration felt that they had enough spare capacity in Venezuela to be able to produce more at this moment to scare off the brethren who aren't talking to us right now. I don't know what their long-term solutions are, but we go into this very wide-eyed. I'll go back to my days at Energy. We used to go to Russia a lot. Okay, the first trip it was great. It was interesting. Second, third, and fourth, the corruption was so evident that how are you even going to do a deal with corruption like this? And I suspect it's the same thing in Venezuela, but to be very honest with you, we're desperate. We're desperate. Peak oil. We've been talking about that for a long time. I don't know that it's not going to be 2030. We're already in 2022, almost halfway through. Again, long-term solutions to get us where we need to go on everything, on various diversified forms of energy. And every time something like this happens, 9/11, okay? What happened in 9/11? We called, at the time, President George W. Bush called the Saudis. And obviously, with everything going on, the Saudis said, don't even ask. We're going to send you millions and millions of barrels just because. You know, you may not need it, but we're going to do it anyway. Every time something like this happens in the geopolitical area, you know, we need to diversify. We need to start, you know, wind farms. We need to do more renewables. Build nuclear plants. Start that refinery back. It never sticks. So I don't know. I don't think 2030. Not unless we have a long-term, consistent plan that goes across every administration, whether Republican or Democrat. Are we going to get there? Yes. Nice young student.
Assuming sufficient political will, is there something about America's geography that makes domestic refining so difficult?
Yeah. Not just geography, but NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? So you have very powerful environmental groups, right? A lot of the Native American community don't want refineries anywhere near some of their lands. Some of the lands are protected federally, like I said, for not only just environmental purposes, protecting the birds. We have that issue in Alaska. So there is a healthy opposition and a debate going on regarding that. So a lot of it is not in my backyard. But I don't mind that debate when you're science-based and you're fact-based. Technology has improved tremendously where some of those objections are not relevant today. So I would say that's probably, other than geography, probably the biggest. And look, we've got the money here. Money is no object. We can get the money. There are companies ready and willing to be able to build these refineries. And federal government dollars would help and assist. In the infrastructure plan that was just passed, Build Back Better, I think it's called. Yeah. And, you know, there's money there for the dying, crumbling infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, refinery capacity. They're everything. I don't know. Anybody else? How are we doing here? Yes?
Do you believe that furthering U.S. energy independence, whether we're fully independent or not, just more so the degree of independence, would influence negotiations with organizations like OPEC and other producing countries?
Yeah.
And if so, what could the United States do to further that independence?
Yeah, sure. So again, from my personal experience, during the Bush administration, I came in January of 2001, right at the beginning of this administration. And the first thing the president said to us at the Energy Department was, I want you to sit down and plot out a plan, okay? And the plan's going to be the role, and it's going to be a playbook, literally, for America's energy independence, the Blue Book. We took 5 months, and by May of 2001, we had everything thought out, chapter by chapter by chapter. In fact, the president came to the Department of Energy in May to congratulate us on this work and to kick off the Mexico, Canada, U.S. working group. Those calls, and we implemented a lot of that throughout certainly the 4 years, but beyond that, the 8 years that President Bush was president. Just the talk and just the planning and the implementing of those sorts of actions, a lot of what I talked about, lifting regulations, allowing for more development, scared a lot of the OPEC producers. I was telling my colleague Rose that over lunch today, who has had a wonderfully distinguished career in the U.S. government, that at one point, when I left the government to go into the private sector, I had many of the OPEC producers say to me, Randa, this fracking stuff, is it real? This energy independence talk in the U.S., are you really doing it? Are you really going forward on it? And it scared them. A little bit of scared, frightened play is not a bad thing. As long as it's real, as long as we can put, you know, our money where our mouth is, so to speak. So I think that's a good thing. You can't just talk energy independence. Like, you can't just talk Made in America. Oh, Made in America, that's a great thing. Well, sure, it's a great thing, but what are you going to do about that? You have to have a plan. If we had a plan backbone. So I do think the talk of that and the action of that, and they were particularly concerned about the fracking issue. That was one that really got them, and that's why we saw the dumping of the natural gas prices. They react pretty quickly to those sorts of things. So I do think that that is helpful.
Thank you.
Yes?
So a little bit more just on our Arab allies. It just seems to me, so I used to live in Dubai and the UAE, that they're a really strong ally. As far as I know, they get the highest technology weaponry once you get out of NATO. They get a lot. Saudi gets a lot.
Yep.
If you put yourself in their seats, either in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh, and you kind of, and why you say, why, is it OPEC is not allowing them to produce more? Is it them? Is it the money? What are the priorities for them that are making them not help us out a little bit more? That's how I think they say it there.
Yeah. So you want to start with the Emirates or the Saudis?
Yeah.
So the Emirates, it's interesting because we've actually been very helpful to them on their new civilian nuclear energy program and other programs. I think that, look, their production levels are all very quiet and secret. I mean, they'll say they're producing X amount, but they don't. As I learned in my government service, they don't tell you the truth. So you really don't know what, but they're definitely coordinating, and there's a sweet spot for them. And I can tell you, it's not $100 a barrel. That is not their sweet spot, and they know that. But like us, they have priorities, right? And what are their priorities? And I don't know. I don't throw around that word ally very lightly, frankly, because especially now when we're seeing this war with Ukraine and Russia, who are our real allies? Your friends come out at the most difficult times, so I'm not sure that they can be called our ally at this point. They're weighing their own interests. Let's see. Do we have any influence over the U.S. with respect to Iran and the JCPOA? They don't like what we're doing in Yemen. They've got their own interests too. Might not match up with us. Okay? But I have to say, we did help them big time in their civilian nuclear. So there's a little bit of how dare you what they're doing. Again, on the Saudis, right? You think they're an ally, but there's so much water under the bridge with respect to that. Let's also talk a little political, if you would indulge me here. Remember, during the campaign, as I mentioned, President Biden called Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman, and the words he used. But it was pretty bad for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, something that Mohammed bin Salman can't forget. And he did a big interview with the Atlantic magazine, the Atlantic magazine, in which he, basically said, screw you, the United States, I'll do what I want to do. So there's a lot of water there. I also think, frankly, with both the Emiratis and the Saudis, they felt like they were in a better place when President Trump was president. And I do think, and I'll say this, and I know it's highly controversial, but I think the Saudis and the Emiratis are doing everything they possibly can to deep six the Biden administration and ensure that President Trump gets reelected again in 2024. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I do think that it's not just in the back of their minds, it's in the front of their minds. Okay? So when it comes to the Emiratis and the Saudis, keep in mind there's a lot of financial deals going on with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law. A lot of things going on with respect to the Abraham Accords that they developed. That is all financially beneficial for the Emiratis and the Saudis behind the scenes. Of course, they're not members of the Abraham Accords. So I have a hard time saying that they're allies right now. It's one thing to say, sorry, President Biden, but we can't pump more. We're loving this price. But not to take a president of the United States phone call, that is beyond unconscionable. And I don't know if this relationship is repairable. President Biden is who he is. Saudis and Emirati leadership are who they are. So I think it's done. Do we have a couple more minutes? There was one more question.
I think we can
Take one more?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have a question?
Sure. If there's anything else you want to add to the Middle East with your great perspective, I'm all ears. But if you just go back to simple economics, a lot of policy seems to work on the supply side, not the demand side. We see it in drugs, we see it in oil.
Yeah.
And for some of the receiving countries on the supplying side, take it personal, as you just pointed out in the Middle East, right? And of course, it happens in Central South America as well. So how do you, when you've heard from your senior positions, discussions, other than things like alternative energy, but why isn't there more condemnation of usage, acceptance of higher energy use taxes, opposition to carbon taxes, things like that to work on the demand side instead of punishing the supply side where we really mostly don't control it and we create antibodies internationally. So just insights as to why that is the way it is.
Yeah, well, I can just tell you from a US perspective, it's not a particularly popular conversation to have. Americans are going to be Americans, and trying to restrict demand in any way, whether it's through taxes or any other mechanism, is not hugely popular politically on either side of the aisle. Americans want what they want when they want it. They want their 3 cars and 17 television, computers, whatever it is, blow dryers. They want to be able to power their houses, and and it's just, it doesn't fly politically, I'm sorry to say. It's a difficult conversation.
It holds terribly, and then it's really hard to build long-term, as we heard this morning in the presentation, the future generation leadership positions on tough issues, because it can't survive the short term.
Yeah, and notice not a whole lot of people are talking climate change right now.